Well, hello there and welcome. This is Emily Midgett here with you today for 6th Street Sundries, and today I have a gouache project using my new Magnolia Apple Blossom stamp set that I designed for Simon Says Stamp. This 6x8 stamp set features a really large bouquet with a large magnolia image and some apple blossoms and foliage and some individual pieces. Really great for coloring, and it's got some coordinating dies, which are always a great tool to have in your craft room. I'm going to be pairing it with the Magnolia Branches embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp, as well as using Midnight Green cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. I've got M Graham Gouache, which in titanium white, and then I've got some liquid watercolors. These are P.H. Martin's liquid watercolors. And to start this project, we're going to stamp the large blossom from Magnolia Apple Blossom onto some of that midnight green cardstock. This is a really nice heavyweight cardstock. It's a very, very dark green that's it's almost black, but it's just not quite there. I've really been getting into colored cardstock lately. I love all of the different vibrance that you can get from colored cardstock. Now, for gouache, we are going to be mixing the liquid watercolors with the white gouache. This is a technique that I saw Debbie Hughes do a really long time ago. She used her regular pan watercolors, but I have an abundance of liquid watercolors in my stash, and I thought it would be fun to pair those liquid watercolors with this white gouache. Now, white gouache is an opaque medium. It's water-based. You can use it like watercolors, but you can also use it kind of like acrylic paint, in that you can use it without having to dilute it with water. So here I am just basically, I've mixed a little bit of that bright, intense fuchsia pink in with that white gouache, and the white gouache has really diluted down the intensity and vibrancy of that pink watercolor into kind of a really pale blush pink. So I am using that mixture to paint kind of what I would envision to be the darker areas of my magnolia image. I'm using it to paint the petals that are kind of tucked behind that would be darker, not the petals that are kind of curled over or that are in the front. Those are going to get a different level of saturation with the pink. We're going to use less pink and more white for those. This is one thing to remember with gouache is that it will usually dry a little bit darker than it will when you put it down on the paper. So I've just kind of done some very basic filling in of those darker areas with that kind of darker pink. You can almost see on the palette itself that color, it dries a little bit darker than initially when you mix it together. So now I have added some more white gouache to that same pink and white mixture, making it a little bit lighter than that initial layer that we put down. I like to think of the white gouache paint like water. I use it to dilute down the color. I use it to make the color less intense so that it helps to kind of create a gradation of color. I have my darker color in the back where the shadowed areas would be, and I have my lighter color in the front where the light would be hitting the flower more directly, so it's going to be lighter. So this is just the first basic layers of color that we're adding down, and then I'll go back in and add a few more highlights and a few more shadows in a little bit. But one thing to remember with gouache is to make sure that you keep plenty of moisture in the fibers of your paintbrush. You don't want your paintbrush to go dry. And I'm very cognizant of how much water is in my paintbrush. I don't want too much and I don't want too little. There's a very fine line with watercolor, but with gouache, you want to be able to smoothly run your paintbrush over that area that you're trying to paint, because you want to create nice smooth lines. The longer and smoother your line is, the more consistent and smoother your painting will look in the end. So now that I've got a basic plan figured out of which petals are light and which petals are dark, which petals are in the shadows, I'm going to add a little bit of more depth and dimension to those petals behind. So I have taken, this is like a dark mahogany color. It's kind of a purpley brown, and I've added it to my white gouache. And this is created kind of, it's almost a mauve color. And so I'm using that to add some shadows to my petals that are kind of curled over on themselves, the petals that are tucked behind, the petals that are in the shadow. I add that little bit of kind of mauve gouache to my petal, and then I pick up some of that original kind of light pink color, and I try to blend those two together. Sometimes I do have to clean my brush and dab it on my stamp chamois and kind of blend those two colors together with that clean brush, but it is a very simple process. You don't have to do a ton of really intricate blending with this technique, with this gouache technique. So here I'm using both of the colors. I've got a very light, almost white shade. I've got a medium pink shade, and then I have that mauve shade that I'm using for the deepest areas of shadow. And I'm just picking and choosing where those highlights go, is where the lightest shade goes. In the middle is to blend the light with the dark, and then the darkest shade, the mauve, goes down into the nooks and crannies, into the deep crevices where the shadows would be. You'll notice that I am continually rotating my watercolor board. I do this so that I can keep the tip of my paintbrush pointed away from me. We've got plenty of moisture, plenty of color on that paintbrush, and I find that I get the best control and the smoothest lines if I have that paintbrush tip pointing away from me. And that allows me to see exactly where that paintbrush tip is going and get the cleanest, smoothest edges. And we want to continue with that contrast with those smooth edges, so that's really an important tip. So now I'm going back in. I've added a little bit more of that hot pink to my white, so it's a little bit more of a medium shade of pink. And I'm just going to add to those petals that are on the very, very front that were almost white. I'm just going to add a little bit of interest to them. I'm going to add a little bit of extra color to the base and kind of pull that up towards the end of the petal. And I'm going to smooth that out with my damp paintbrush that I do add a little bit of white gouache just to kind of blend everything together nicely. But I am adding, this is just one last little effort to add a little bit of shape, a little bit of shadow, a little bit of detail to this image. Because it is such a large, nicely sized image, you can get down in there and add those little nooks and crannies. You can add those little details that make the paintings more exciting. So now for one last little touch of detail, I am taking almost completely white and I'm just cleaning up the edges of some of those petals. Some of the petals, they kind of got a little bit blurred, and in order to, with no line coloring, contrast is your most important tool to keeping that shape. And so that petal that's kind of curled over on itself, the edges of the petals, I want to add just a touch of white to the edge of those petals to make sure that those lines and those edges are nice and clean and that they are crisp and obviously where one petal ends where the next petal begins. So now it's time to work on the foliage. The foliage, I'm going to mix two different shades. One of them is kind of a jungle green and one of them is more of an olive green. I love mixing and matching colors that I wouldn't normally put together. And this created kind of a really lovely, like a dark minty green. It's a very pretty color. I've mixed it with more of the white gouache, again, diluting that bright color down with that white gouache. Think of it like your water. The more white gouache you add to the liquid watercolors, the less intense and vibrant those colors are going to be. So here, again, I am doing some very basic coloring, some very basic painting, just to kind of determine where my darker areas are going to be. This initial layer does not have to be anything particularly fancy. I do go in, after I have colored the entire thing, I do go in with some white gouache on the very edges, just to add a little bit of extra highlight to the edges of those pieces of foliage, just to add a little bit more interest to them. When I add the white gouache to the edges of those petals, I make sure that I'm doing that still when the original green gouache is still wet, so that it's easier to blend the two different colors together. So now that I have done my initial plan, my initial layout of which foliage pieces are darker versus lighter, I'm going to go back in. I have created an even darker version of that same minty green. I've added a little bit more pigment to my white gouache to make it a little bit darker, and I'm going to add this darker color to the pieces of foliage that are kind of tucked behind the flowers, behind the apple blossoms. They're tucked behind, so of course they're going to be a little bit more in shadow, which to me, that signals that they're going to be a little bit more intense in the color. So I add a little bit more vibrancy to the color itself. You'll notice that the contrast of the lighter foliage on top versus the darker foliage behind helps to create that illusion in your mind. When your mind's eye sees it, it helps to create that illusion of shadow and shape. So now we have our finished die cut painted piece. I love how vibrant that gouache looks on that really dark cardstock. So I've just run the midnight green cardstock with the Magnolia Branches embossing folder. I've cut it to a mini slimline size, and I've run it through my die cut machine. And now I'm splattering just some plain white gouache on that background. I love the texture that just those few little white splatters add. So I'm going to add the painted die cut piece to the background with some foam adhesive for extra dimension, lots of dimension and texture on this card, but still allowing that magnolia, that painted magnolia, to be the star of the show. Using the same color cardstock for the die cut as for the background, I think really allows that painting to be the focal point of the card. So I've added a greeting from the Magnolia Apple Blossom set, which I've embossed onto a strip of that midnight green cardstock, and I've added it with a double layer of foam tape for extra height. And now I'm just going to add a few milk glass gems, which are from Trinity Stamps. I'm really loving all of their bling. They have beautiful shades of jewels. And there you have it. This is a finished card. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a little bit longer than normal, but I had a lot of information to get to you. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll try adding liquid watercolors to white gouache. It's such a fun technique, and it's something super different from what we normally see. So if you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up and maybe hit the subscribe button so you can see some more content from me in the future. And head over to my blog at emilymidgett.com to see all of the details on this project. And a couple more projects for the Simon Says stamp release. So thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.